Today we take up the remaining part of the sources of international law. Yesterday I had just mentioned to you under Article 38, paragraph 1 of the Statute of the World Court, there are only 4 sources of international law which are recognized. And when we make a mention of these sources, they are: the first source is international treaties, the second one international custom as an evidence of a source of law before an international court. The third one is general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. The fourth one, juristic writings and judicial decisions. So both juristic writings, that is writings of the most highly qualified publicists, as well as judicial decisions, constitute as a subsidiary source of international law. We take up today treaties as a source of international law. Now when we speak about the treaties are classified under 2 heads. Treaties which create general principles of international law, and treaty contracts. Now when we take up treaties which create general principles of international law, they are classified under 2 heads. The first one is treaties which create universal rules of international law, and the second one is treaties which create fairly general rules. Now when we take up treaties which create universal rules of international law, under the existing rules of international law there is only one treaty, and this treaty is called as the Charter of United Nations. The Charter of United Nations is a universal treaty. When a member becomes a party or when a state ratifies the Charter of United Nations, there are certain provisions under the Charter which are to be accepted, which have to be adhered, and which are to be followed by the members as well as non-members of the United Nations as well. You may take into consideration one provision, and this provision is Article 2, paragraph 6 of the Charter of United Nations. Article 2, paragraph 6 of the Charter of United Nations points out the Charter of United Nations is binding even on non-members of the United Nations. Even non-members of the United Nations are supposed to act in accordance with the Charter principles. They cannot violate international peace and security. They have to indulge and promote international cooperation. They have to protect basic human rights. Discrimination based on sex, race, and ethnic group is not allowed. A non-member of the United Nations, if he does it, naturally it will attract the United Nations, and the United Nations is empowered to take certain measures as well. That is the reason the United Nations creates an obligation not only on members who ratified it, but even on members who have not ratified the Charter of United Nations. Now the other thing is treaties, the second one, treaties which create fairly general rules. Now under the present day, the entire source of international law are known to the students of law through international treaties. A scholar of international law, when he gave the statistics, pointed out between 1864 to 1914, there were as many as 257 multilateral treaties that were signed. That virtually speaks about the growing importance of treaties. Now what happened after 1914? After 1914, between 1914 and then the First World War came in. After the conclusion of the First World War, you may be knowing the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Then the League of Nations, as an international institution to maintain peace and security, was able to sign or to convene or tell the states to ratify several treaties for the maintenance of international peace and security. And you might be knowing the Slavery Convention came to be established, and this was done at the behest of the League of Nations. Thereafterwards, the Charter of United Nations came in 1945. Under the auspices of the Charter of United Nations, several treaties were signed. And when I speak of several treaties, remember these treaties were on different subjects. And on different subjects concerning the world community, discussions took place and sessions have taken place in different places, and we were able to achieve uniform rules for the purpose of acceptance for the benefit of mankind. Now, for example, take the Treaty on Weights and Measures, take the Treaty on Red Cross, take the treaties on narcotic drugs of 1961, or you take the establishment of the International Monetary Fund itself, or you take the Convention of the Law of the Sea of 1982. These are major treaties. In the recent past, the establishment of the WTO and several other treaties which were signed as part of the WTO by the members of the United Nations. Thus, treaties are acting as an important source of international law. From certain quarters, there are criticisms which are levelled, and these criticisms go to the extent of pointing out that these multilateral treaties which are signed on different subjects are not law creating and they are not law making. But then the very object and purpose of the treaty, as well as the discussions that have undergone in signing the treaty itself, clearly points out that they are law making. I just intend to give you one or two instances or illustrations. Take the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Simultaneously, take the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Likewise, take the Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982. Now, in these conventions, remember, before the convention was brought before the General Assembly of the United Nations by the Secretary General for its acceptance, lots and lots of discussions have taken place between members of the United Nations. And these discussions have taken place in different parts of the world through and sessions. And only after coming into a consensus, arriving at a consensus, these treaties were signed by the international community. Now, for example, take the instance of the Convention of the Law of the Sea of 1982. The discussion for the adoption of the Convention of the Law of the Sea has actually begun in 1973 in a conference on the third conference on the Law of the Sea. And the discussions, remember, used to take place in sessions, and there were almost 9 sessions that have taken place. Each and every issue relating to the Law of the Sea, starting from the territorial sea, contiguous zone, economic zone, then the doctrine of high seas, the freedom of navigation, all of them, the rights of the landlocked states, all of them were discussed threadbare, and it took almost 9 years. And in the 10th session, which was held at Caracas, and the convention was signed in the year 1982. Now you take one more instance of a major treaty which has come into force since 1st January 1995, the establishment of the World Trade Organization. Now the discussion for establishing an organization and the discussions of the preceding organization, that is GATT, and its weaknesses began in 1986. First session began in 1986 on September 20th. Thereafterwards, remember, there were many sessions. Every year it used to take place in different parts of the world. The state representatives would put forward their viewpoint, and having put forward their viewpoint, the convention ultimately was adopted in 1984, and it was signed and it came into force in 1985. Now, if you read any of the provisions of the articles of these conventions, it clearly points to one point. Now, most of them are law-making. It speaks about the provisions of law. It speaks about the liabilities as well as the responsibilities and the duties of states in carrying out the responsibilities which is undertaken by them once they ratify the provisions of these treaties. There are other treaties which we call as treaty contracts. When I speak about the treaty contracts, now treaty contracts are not of a multilateral nature. It is signed by only a few states. And when once it is signed by a few states, over a period of time, the principles which are part of this treaty, if it is considered as good, it will be accepted by the community of nations. Now, for example, there are 2 instances which I can give you. One happened to be the Treaty of Extradition. The Treaty of Extradition in its origin is bilateral. It has done with a purpose. Now, for example, what would happen is in a situation wherein there is some trouble in a state, the leaders who get to power intend to catch hold of the parties who are in opposition, and afterwards they want to try them or book them or kill them, whatever. In situations like this, the leader of the opposition, if he escapes to a foreign country, remember, he is entitled to asylum. Now this concept, the very purpose of this concept was started bilaterally. The concept of extradition, for example, when he goes there, or suppose, for example, a person, a national of a particular state commits a heinous crime. Having committed a heinous crime, he escapes from country A to country B. At that time, the country most interested in trying is country A. And this country naturally will demand from state B for the sake of trial. So extradition treaties essentially are bilateral even today. You might be knowing the government of India is asking for extradition of Vijay Mallya. Simultaneously, it is asking for extradition of some other people. Now these people, having committed the crime against the Indian laws, have escaped from our jurisdiction and have taken the jurisdiction or citizenship or some other thing of some other country. In situations like this, the country most wanted them naturally has a right to demand them for the sake of trial. So these extradition treaties have grown bilaterally, and today it is recognized as a general principle of international law recognized by the community of nations. Now the second one, most important thing, happened to be the office of the consular and the consular privileges. Now right from the time of Romans, from the Roman civilization, the consulars are appointed, the consul general was appointed by the state of Rome to another foreign country to protect the trade interests of the state of Rome with that country to which he is accredited. In circumstances such as this, over a period of time, they were called as consuls, and the office of the consul became permanent mission now. Now India has consuls or the consular general's office in many countries of the world. And they go there and try to see that India's trade interest as well as the trade interest of the receiving country is protected. And that is where today, under the present day international law, they have become what we call as, remember, universally accepted by the community of nations. Almost all the states have consular's office. What was originated by way of a bilateral treaty between two states today is being accepted as a principle of international law, and it is part of a general principle of international law, remember, entered through and by bilateral treaties. Now, there are, when we speak about other important development happen to be, there are certain treaties which are called as community treaties. Now, you may be knowing, what do you mean by community treaties? Now, in the European theatre, there are what we call as the regional laws. The European communities themselves came together, and it is called as the institutions of Europe. Right from, remember, after the First World War, when the League of Nations came in, most of the European members wanted to have European institutions. But it did not materialize then. But it materialized only in 1950 by signing a treaty on the Council of Europe. When once it is signed, they had certain objectives. Those members who are part of the European Council should be in a position to protect human rights. Basic human rights shall be protected. Then they wanted to have a treaty that would be common agricultural policy between the European nations, and what we call as common transport policy between the European nations. Then they wanted to have the common health policy between the European nations. Now this is how what we call as the community rules between the European nations developed, and today, remember, all of them have been developed by the European states amongst themselves through the signing of treaties, and it is called as what we call as community rules. Now there is other type of treaties which are called as the regional treaties. Now when I speak about regional treaties, which also serve at a future date as a source of international law. In the subcontinent, we have the SAARC, Southeast Asian Association for Cooperation. Now, this SAARC treaty is a treaty wherein almost all the 7 SAARC nations have come together, and all of them have agreed to cooperate each other. And country which has more resources would go to the rescue of the other which has either no resources or resources which is collected are not enough for the development. Now, development has to take place, and for this purpose the national capita or the per capita or the resources that are mobilized is not good enough. So the other members go to the rescue to see that there is peace and security that is assured and guaranteed. Now, if this is the situation in South Asia, naturally the African countries have come together for this purpose. Long ago in the 1960s itself, they have established what we call as the Organization of African Unity. The very purpose of establishing Organization of African Unity is for the welfare of almost all the African nations, who are more than 60 nations today. Simultaneously, we have the Latin American group. The Latin American countries have come together and established a forum of their own. This is also for the regional peace, regional cooperation, regional development, regional protection and promotion of human rights. And we have defense pacts like the NATO. Now, in the event of a difficulty, now all the NATO members who have ratified the treaty, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, would come together and everyone will be against the aggressor. If a NATO member is invaded, all of them come together. And these are all certain type of treaties which have come in and which serve as a source of international law. Now, there are other type of treaties which are being spoken. Now, certain treaties have originated only once in a bilateral treaty. At a later stage, after the lapse of years, this is being recognized as a good principle of international law. Now, when we take up this matter, now for example, one such treaty was a treaty which was signed in the 1653, so 1650, and this treaty was signed between the state of Spain as well as Northern Province. Northern Province is the state of United States, the present state of United States. Now, what exactly are the provisions of this treaty? Enemy goods carried in a neutral vessel should be free from attack. So, any enemy goods which are carried in a neutral vessel is not subject to the attack, was expressed for the first time in a treaty which was signed between the northern provinces as well as the state of Spain. Now later, remember, it became a rule which is accepted by the community of nations. Simultaneously, remember, a treaty when it comes into force should be of a norm creating character. If it is not going to create a norm, it cannot be accepted by the community of nations. You may be interested to know, this matter came up in the beautiful case which is known as the North Sea Continental Shelf cases decided by the International Court of Justice in the year 1969. Now there, what has happened was, it related to the division of the continental shelf between the state of Denmark and Federal Republic of Germany, as well as the Federal Republic of Germany and the state of Holland. Now this was relating to the North Sea, which is in concave shape. The Geneva Convention of 1958, under Article paragraph 6(2), pointed out the division of continental shelf of opposite states shall take place by applying the equidistance method. Both the state of Denmark as well as the state of Holland wanted to apply this principle. Now when they wanted to apply this principle, the state of Germany pointed out the Treaty of 1958, that is the Geneva Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1958, cannot be accepted because it has not created an acceptable norm. When it said like that, it pointed out its own instance. No doubt it had taken part in the proceedings of the conference, and it had signed the proceedings of the conference, but then it has not ratified the Convention of the Law of the Sea, Geneva Convention of the Law of the Sea of 1958. Since it has not ratified, provisions of Article 6, paragraph 2 is not binding on itself. See, the very purpose of saying this, a treaty, before it is signed, naturally the parties will discuss the matter. And when once they discuss the matter, they sign the proceedings. When once the proceedings are signed, the matter goes to the state, and thereafterwards an act of ratification will have to take place in accordance with the municipal law of that state. Now the state of Germany said, since we have not signed, it is not binding. And moreover, it is not accepted by many. And it is not in a position to generate a norm which should be by consensus by all the communities of the world. So with the result, a claim naturally was given to the state of Germany, and her contention was accepted as the real contention, and a judgment was given in favor of the state of Germany. Now the other important aspect is, most of these treaties speak of one more principle. Now the existence of a treaty on a particular subject speaks about an evidentiary principle. Now for example, take it this way, there are certain treaties, as I mentioned, a treaty which was signed in 1650. Or take an instance relating to a treaty that is signed in England relating to the what we call as the war, naval war that was taking place during the time of Napoleon. Now these type of treaties are distinct and very difficult to find in situations, but then they are the existing evidence, and this evidence actually helps the international community to grow further. Having discussed this much, we go to another source of international law, and this source of international law is called as the decisions of the judicial and arbitral tribunals. Now to what extent the judgment of the International Court of Justice is binding? Whether a judgment of the International Court of Justice is able to create a precedent. Now for example, take it this way, under Article 141 of the Constitution of India, when the Supreme Court gives a judgment, that judgment is binding on all. No. Remember, everyone, every state, every individual is supposed to adhere to the judgment laid down by the Supreme Court of India. That is where it says, the law laid down by the Supreme Court shall be binding on all of us. So similarly, in international court, whether such a practice exists is the basic question. Now when we take up this matter, we have to go to Article 59 of the Statute of the World Court. Article 59 of the Statute of the World Court points out the judgment of the International Court of Justice is binding only parties to the dispute, and only in that case. Thus far, no further. So that means what? The decision of the International Court of Justice is binding only between the parties to the dispute. If India and Pakistan were to go for the resolution of a dispute, the judgment is binding only between them, and only in that instant case. Thus far, no further. And nothing can be said beyond that. Now when we take up or go further, there are certain duties that is being put on the International Court of Justice as well. When I speak about the duties that are being put before the International Court of Justice, as I just mentioned to you in one of the lectures earlier, under Article 9 of the Statute of the World Court, the International Court of Justice represents the main form of civilization and composed from almost all the legal systems of the world. Now in situations like this, remember, it is the duty of the International Court of Justice to refine and to define and to promote rules of international law. So when they try to refine, define and promote rules of international law, the judgment of the International Court of Justice, although are not creating a precedent, have played far-reaching influence on the states and members of the international community. You may be interested to know how far they have played an important role. Now one instance happened to be an instance in the year 1950, for the first time, 1949-50, the International Court of Justice gave a judgment on the reparation case. In the reparation case, when they gave the judgment, they pointed out the international institutions and the United Nations have a personality of its own. And since it has a personality of its own, it can sue as well as be sued. Now, although the judgment was given in 1949, at a later stage, this is acting as a precedent. And whenever a case goes before the International Court of Justice between states, this matter need not be proved because it is stated already. You have a personality of your own. You can sue as well as be sued. Now, another instance happened to be an instance that was decided in the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case of 1951. Now, in the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case of 1951, now the state of Norway deviated from the existing rules of customary international law. This is what the state of England pointed out before the court. Under the existing rules of customary international law, the territorial sea or the breadth of the territorial sea has to be measured by adopting what we call as the low water mark. And the state of Norway pointed out, since the coast of Norway is deeply indented, since it is in a curvature form or a zigzag form, remember, what we call as the low water mark method cannot be adopted. So the King of Norway in the year 1936 adopted certain points on the coast, and these points may be small islands, it may be fjords, or it may be rocks, or it may be roadsteads. And afterwards he adopted these points, and from there he drew a line outside the low water mark. And this distance, up to a distance of 4 miles, was called as the territorial sea of the state of Norway. Now, in this case, what has happened was the state of England objected severely. They landed before the court, and the court actually gave recognition of the contention of the state of Norway. See, it is a geographical factor, it is a geological factor, it is a morphological factor. And these factors are to be taken into consideration by the international court. It is not man-made. Where low water mark method is not possible, the court is empowered to decide the matter on what we call as the box method, which was adopted by the state of Norway. Now, I just intend to speak to you and tell you what was adopted and accepted in the judgment in the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case of 1951 has been accepted by the international community in the Geneva Convention of 1958 on the law of the sea. What was accepted in 1958 in the Geneva Convention has been accepted in the 1982 Convention on the law of the sea. Now that means what? The box method, selecting the baseline or the territorial waters of a coastal state from certain selected points have been accepted by the international community. Remember, even in treaties, and the contribution naturally goes to the International Court of Justice. Now, this is how international law is being developed. Now, when I speak about the other decisions, there are plenty of other decisions of the International Court of Justice as well, wherein, remember, the International Court of Justice, when it gave the judgment, it had to be respected, and it is acting as a principle of international law. One such principle happened to be an advisory opinion which was given by the International Court of Justice. And this advisory opinion relates to an issue before the Security Council. The members of Security Council, all of them, all the 15 members participate in the meeting. And having participated in the meetings of the Security Council, when the voting comes, they quietly leave the meeting hall. They abstain from themselves from voting. Now, this has become a common feature. They come, they participate, they shout, they discuss, but when the matter of voting is held, they abstain from voting. When it became a regular feature, the matter was referred to the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice pointed out all the members of the Security Council are expected to be in the headquarters of the United Nations all the 24 hours. And they are supposed to contribute for the maintenance of international peace and security. And when they participate in the meeting, they are not supposed to, remember, abstain from its decision. And if they abstain, they will be supporting the majority of opinion. And abstention tantamounts to concurrence. was decided by the International Court of Justice long, long ago. When this decision was given, remember, even to this day, this decision is in vogue. This decision is accepted. It is not being challenged, and everyone liked this. They have to participate, they have to vote. This was the decision. That is where, remember, even the International Court of Justice in many ways helped in the development of international law. Now, other important case happened to be effect of awards of the Administrative Tribunal of the United Nations decided in 1954. Now, in this case, for the first time, the International Court of Justice pointed out the General Assembly has created an organ which is known as the Administrative Tribunal. When it created an organ, if you look to the Travaux preparatories, it clearly shows that it is a judicial organ. That means what? If a judicial organ, if the Administrative Tribunal, when it delivers the judgment in deciding the contract of service of the United Nations employees, its judgment is res judicata and it is binding even on the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, it was given in 1954 and it is accepted until this far. This is where International Court of Justice helps in the development of international law. Although its decisions don't act as a precedent, it has so much of influence and so far-reaching influence. It is appreciated, admired, applauded, quoted, cited by almost all the scholars in the area of international law. Now, there is one more and type of decision. This is called as the Nuremberg judgment, for example. Now, when I speak about the Nuremberg judgment, the Nuremberg judgment, remember, happened to be a judgment of the war tribunal. And this war tribunal, which was constituted by the allied victorious powers, the state of France, the state of England, the state of United States, the state of Russia, Soviet Russia. And before this tribunal, which was constituted, 22 German war criminals were produced. And of the 22, 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. And 7 of them were convicted from 10 years to life. 3 of them were acquitted. And 3 of the 6 organizations were found to be criminal. Now, the purpose of saying this, see, a judgment which was deciding issues like violation of human rights, like genocide and war crime, could be an inspiration to others. That means in the event, in future, if some state does like this, now there is always a judgment behind. And this judgment is nothing but the judgment of the Nuremberg, wherein the judgment went to the extent of pointing out the crimes against international law are committed by men and not by abstract entities like states. And only by punishing these men can the provisions of international law be enforced. Now, thereafterwards we go to decisions of the European Court. There are decisions of the European Court, European Justice of the Court of European Community, European Court of Human Rights. All of them are binding on the parties because they have, in the treaty itself, they have accepted to adhere and to carry out the decisions. Simultaneously, we have the Latin American Court of Human Rights. There also judgments are being given and they are being respected and carried out. And we have even in Africa to a certain extent as well. Now, with which we go to the other important source of international law, state judicial decisions. Now, when I speak about the state judicial decisions, whether the decisions which are delivered by a state court should be respected or not. If they are to be respected, how far they have to be respected. Honorable Justice Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, long, long ago, in one of the cases pointed out, the decisions of the state court naturally helps a student and scholar to understand how international law is understood by that country. How the courts in that state have understood and appreciated the prevalence of the rules of international law. And this is a major statement which was delivered now by a great man known as Justice Marshall. A case came up before the Supreme Court of the United States in the year 1899, and this case is known as the Paquet, Habana and Dalola. In Paquet, Habana and Dalola, Justice Gray, one of the judges of the Supreme Court of the United States, pointed out, international law is part of our law, and it is the duty of the courts in this country to respect this law. Further, he added, where there is no treaty, where there is no custom, where there is no principle of law, resort must be had to the writings of the most highly qualified publicists, who, by their years of experience and labor, have come to a conclusion what the law is and what the law not ought to be. So this is what we learn from the judgments of this type. Now one more important decision happened to be the British courts. The British courts during the Napoleonic era gave wonderful judgment. And these wonderful judgments were delivered by one man, Lord Stowell. Lord Stowell during his lifetime was called as the judicial legislator. Judicial legislator of the state of England. Now there are many cases which came before what we call as the prize court. Now prize court is a court which is constituted by the state but it applies rules of international law. Now as a judge and the presiding officer of the prize court, he was the one who went to the extent of saying a blockade in order to be binding must be effective. Suppose for example during the course of the Second World War, there were certain states which went to the extent of declaring an act of blockade. And by an act of blockade, remember about 2,000 nautical miles of their coast were blockaded. But these states had only one or two vessels. The blockade, in order to be binding, must be effective. You should have the naval warfare. You should have the naval strength. And without the naval strength and spirit, you cannot just control it. That was one of the judgments. Then the other one is doctrine of continuous voyage and continuous transformation. So in the doctrine of continuous voyage and continuous transformation, always he would say, what is the enemy destination? Now suppose, for example, the ship may go to several states, but then the cargo which is within the vessel ultimately is of enemy destination. Since it is of enemy destination, according to the principle of continuous transportation and continuous voyage, is liable to be captured by the belligerent states. That is one of the judgment which was given. Now, having spoken about state judicial decisions, you might be knowing the two important cases which came before, one before the American court and the other one came before the English court. The case which came before the American court, which I have just mentioned to you, happened to be Paquet, Habana and Dalola. And the case which came before the British court happened to be the famous Koshia case, wherein the court, British court, was able to say that the law that was adopted in 1863 and by 1864, when it became a customary rule of international law, it had to be adhered, it had to be respected, it had to be followed, and the fault actually lay with the American vessel Berkshire. That is how international law operates. Now with which we go to discuss something relating to arbitral decisions. When I speak about the decisions of the Court of Arbitration, today, remember, in the era of a globalized world, the settlement of disputes through and by arbitration is encouraged. But then it has a history of its own. When I speak about the history of its history, for the first time there was a beautiful case which was decided between the state of England as well as United Provinces, America, United States. And this is called as the Alabama arbitration case. The Alabama arbitration for the first time awarded damages to such an extent for the violation of the principle of neutrality by the state of England. And the state of England, remember, gave the money or the prize money that was awarded in the judgment to the state of United States. Now thereafter we have what we call as the other type of arbitration, the Bering Sea Fisheries arbitration, which was decided in 1893, the Pious Fund case 1902, the North Atlantic Coast Fisheries arbitration of 1910, then you have the Island of Palmas arbitration of 1928, Remember, that actually helped in developing the rules of international law by these arbitral decisions as well. Now, from certain quarters, there are criticisms that is being leveled against this. You may be interested to know what type of criticisms. Now, arbitrators always are compromisers and they act like diplomats. So, arbitrators are compromisers and behave like diplomats, and they don't care for the provisions of law. Now, for such people, one of the greatest arbitrators of the last century, J.B. Moore, John Bassett Moore, an American arbitrator who wrote volumes on international arbitration, now pointed out, in his time as an arbitrator, he failed to come across a particular case wherein the arbitrator has appointed as a compromiser. Never ever an arbitrator acts as a compromiser. Remember, first and foremost, he says, first you have to look into the arbitration deed, and they function under a law. In all matters, they are supposed to go by the law and the deed and the concerned arbitration act enacted by the countries. If this is a dispute between the state of France and the United States, they are bound by these laws which are enacted. Then what we call as the provisions of the agreement, that made them to go before the court of arbitration. In circumstances such as this, what is indicated cannot be accepted. And he further points out, ultimately what is important is whom you bring as an arbitrator. The quality, the capacity and the integrity of the person. If the person is highly knowledgeable and is known for his integrity, he is not bothered, he will never act as a compromiser. And his matter, his jurisdiction only is to see the existing law, and afterwards, in accordance with the law, he will put this judgment and go away. Now, the other important point which I just wanted to speak to you, juristic works as source of international law. Now, juristic works, could they act as source of international law, is a question which is being put. Now, today, both judicial decisions as well as juristic works under clause 4 of Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice act as source of international law. Now, they are subsidiary sources. They are taken by way of evidence. Now, when I speak of this, there are one or two cases which came before the court. One such case happened to be the Pequit-Habana and the Lola, wherein Justice Gray clearly pointed out, when you don't have any source of international law, naturally, to prove a particular point, to accept a particular point, to consider a particular view, you have to rely on the writings of the most qualified publicists who have worked years together on that point. Having worked years together on that point, they have expressed their viewpoints as well. And if these viewpoints are generally acceptable, why can't we quote it in a particular judgment? Now, the first case that came in before the Judicial Privy Council, Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, happened to be in the year 1934. Now, this was the famous case Re Piracy Jure Gentium. Now, Re Piracy Jure Gentium happened to be a case decided by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in 1934. You may be interested to know what exactly are the facts of this case. Now, in this case, what has happened was, in the Hong Kong waters, 2 Chinese ships were chased by another Chinese vessel. So, immediately the matter was brought to the knowledge of Her Majesty's Navy, because Hong Kong at that time was part and parcel of the state of United Kingdom. At that time, the naval guards get alerted themselves. Having alerted themselves, they go to the spot and they arrest all the 3 vessels. Having arrested all the 3 vessels, the charge sheet was filed and it came before the High Court of Hong Kong. And in the High Court of Hong Kong, the judge was putting a question whether robbery could be committed if an act from the side of the parties has not taken place. In other words, he was just putting a question, can you charge the concerned parties for the purpose of piracy if they have not committed an act of robbery. And ultimately the court came to the conclusion that since they have not committed robbery, the suit has to be dismissed, and they dismissed forthwith. But then the matter came before the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. When it came before the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, the question was very simple: whether robbery is an essential element of the crime of piracy. Now, the International Court of the concerned court, Privy Council pointed out, robbery is not an essential element of the crime of piracy. Even a frustrated attempt to commit robbery would be tantamount to piracy. A frustrated attempt, if it is done by the parties, they may not have succeeded. This would be considered as piracy. So that a warning bell has to be given to all people who indulge in acts like this to save humanity from the scourge of an act of piracy. Now, having spoken about this, I have to just mention the use of sources. Under the present day international law, when we speak about the use of sources, the sources are to be used in accordance with the principle that is being laid down under Article 38 of the Statute of the World Court. First one is treaties in a case acts as a source of international law. Where there are no treaties, then custom can come as an evidence of a source of international law. Then the third one, the general principle of law recognized by civilized nations. A common principle, commonly accepted, commonly practiced, has to be a source of international law. And the last one is judicial decisions and the writings of the most highly qualified publicists also act as a source of international law. The last point that is being left in this chapter happened to be preemptory norms of international law. Preemptory norm of international law is called as the Grund norm. Now, a particular principle is being established as a norm of international law. Now, Article 53 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties reads thus: a treaty is void if it violates the existing rules of international law. That means what? Whenever a treaty is signed by states, it may be a bilateral treaty, or it may be a trilateral treaty, or it may be a multilateral treaty. These treaties are to respect and should respect the existing rules of international law. If they fail to respect these rules of international law, it is supposed to be void and it has no legal effect. This is what is Article 53 of the Charter of the Law of Treaties of 1969. Now, the point at issue is, now can we speak anything from public law or public policy or from the laws of a particular state? Now, under the municipal law of a particular state, you have a provision under the contract law. An agreement, if it violates public policy, is void. All agreements are supposed to be in accordance with the public policy of the concerned state, enacted from time to time. If it violates, it cannot be accepted, it cannot be enforced. Now, that is where some such thing is being spoken. Now, for example, an instance can be given, and this instance happened to be an instance relating to piracy. Whether 2 or 3 states come together and sign a treaty in the promotion and protection of piracy, we will make money, earn wealth by championing the cause of piracy. Such treaty is void. It cannot be accepted under the present day law. So that is why it is called as public policy of a particular state. Similar to is in the area of international law. When we take up this matter, there are several instances that came in under the present day international law. Now, many of the writers go to the extent of pointing out it is jus cogens, a norm which has to be accepted by the community of nations. When they speak of a norm, which are the norms? The first one, they spoke about the sovereign equality of states. And some writers go to the extent of pointing out sovereign equality of states is a jus cogens. Then they say peaceful settlement of disputes. It is a jus cogens. The third one is racial discrimination, any kind of racial discrimination is absolutely prohibited under Article 1, Paragraph 3 of the Charter of United Nations. Then they speak about institutions practicing slavery. It cannot be accepted by the international community. Now these are a few areas, war crimes, it cannot be accepted. Now when we speak about this, most of the scholars are saying this should also be treated and considered as a norm of international law. But then under the present day international law, until this date, there are only two norms from which no derogation is permitted. And if it is derogated, remember the very act as well as the treaty which is signed to this effect is void. And you may be interested to know which are they. The first one is treaties relating to piracy. No state can come forward and states can think of initiating an agreement in promoting piracy and protecting piratical acts. That is void. The second one is war crimes. When I speak about war crimes, you might be knowing the Nuremberg Tribunal for the first time went to the extent of pointing out it is not Germany which has committed the crime. It is German nationals who are responsible citizens violated the basic rules of international law and they punished them and executed. So war crimes as well as piratical acts, remember, are considered as the two norms. Others are given as supplementary. Many instances or instances which are being accepted by the Charter of United Nations can be spoken, but that cannot qualify under Article 53 of the Charter of United Nations. Now there is one more provision. The other provision happened to be Article 64 of the Charter. Article 64 of the Charter of United Nations points out when a new norm of international law emerges, the earlier norm is replaced by the new norm. So when a new norm of international law emerges, suppose for example tomorrow the international community intend to promote certain acts which are prohibited now. On such an event, remember the present norm will be replaced by the new norm under Article 64 of the Charter of United Nations. Thank you.